Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our next panel conversation. This afternoon, we have the great privilege of hearing from Carol Christ and Bobby Hackett, and I will do brief introductions shortly, but our topic today is called Challenging the Constraints, and we're looking at the constraints through the lens of access. And access has been a word that I think I've heard in every session we've had. So I don't know about Bobby and Carol, but I'm feeling enormous pressure right now because clearly it's something that is on everyone's mind. I can't imagine two better people to have this conversation with than Carol and Bobby. And as I said, you can read their bios in the conference program, but currently Carol is the interim executive chancellor at UC-Berkley. She's the former president of Smith College, and she serves on the board of trustees at Dominican College, and
Sarah Lawrence.
And Sarah Lawrence. I feel better now because it stumped us both, and Sarah Lawrence. And so she brings a wonderful perspective. One of the pieces that's been really gratifying today is to hear a bit of pushback on the bifurcation between the liberal arts and professional preparation, the liberal arts and research institutions, and Carol brings a unique and important perspective to that conversation. Bobby Hackett is in his 24th year at the Bonner Foundation, which is located in Princeton, New Jersey. Bobby is currently serving as the president at the Bonner Foundation. If I could just take a quick poll, how many schools in here are Bonner schools? So there are a few. There are a few here. So I'll invite Bobby to share a little bit about the Bonner program, but Bobby's focus has been on civic engagement and really the essence of the liberal arts as a tool for promoting an educated citizenry and supporting our democracy. So we thought we'd spend our time as follows. Both Bobby and Carol will give a 5 to 7 minute dialogue at the beginning. I'm going to pose a couple of questions for them, and they'll each have an opportunity to talk. Then we will have a conversation around 3 or 4 questions before we open it up to Q&A. So the opening dialogue, the opening question that I wanted to pose to Bobby and to Carol is really an effort to continue the conversation. I hope you're seeing the connections between the sessions that we've had so far. And our goal for this segment was really to continue the conversation based on what we've heard in earlier sessions and really to give you a sense of an ongoing conversation. So really 4 questions are what I will pose to Bobby and Carol as they provide these opening comments. The first question comes out of last night's conversation with Andrew Delbanco, and I want them to think about, within the context of access, currently in higher ed, who gets to think and who gets to choose? So that's the first question I'd like them to think through. The second, from our first panel this morning, is how do we ensure consistency of experience for all of the students that we educate? From our panel on economic constraints, I'm asking them to focus on how do we address the competing issues of access and cost in order to become more inclusive in higher education? And then finally, from Zakia's luncheon plenary session, she talked about the problem of reducing measuring and understanding to, she cautioned us to avoid a reductionist attitude when we think about measuring and understanding our effectiveness. So what I've posed to Bobby and Carol is, how do we measure and understand our effectiveness around access without succumbing to a reductionist attitude? So those are the 4 big questions that I pose, and I invite Carol to begin. Thank you, Carol.
Oh, thank you, Mary. These are really big questions, and I wanted to begin by setting a context that I was reminded of by Charlie's comment this morning, power of a place rules. And that reminded me of what a friend of mine calls the snowflake phenomenon. That is, each of us is a snowflake, completely unique, unable to be duplicated. And I think that that stands in our way often in thinking about both the economics of higher education and really the question that Andrew posed last night, who gets to think, who gets to choose? And I'm just going to repeat very briefly some of the kinds of barriers to access that we've already talked about, just so that there is a framing context. We have reached a point, particularly in smaller institutions, where the model of high tuition, high financial aid has really reached a breaking point, where we are increasingly dependent on merit aid. In other words, giving aid to families that can more rather than less afford our institutions in order to both fill our classrooms and our dormitories, but also to produce enough income for the college to operate. And we also suffer from what I think are problems of scale, that it's very difficult to run colleges and universities at certain scales, given everything that you need to do, so that there are, as everyone in this room knows, huge financial problems, challenges that are facing this sector. At the same time, we're seeing a dramatic change in the nature of the students that are going to college. So another kind of set of blinkers, I think, that we all wear in addition to the snowflake phenomenon, which is, I believe, as much a problem at a place like Berkeley as it was at a place like Smith, that we imagine all students as between 18 and 22 going to a 4-year continuous liberal arts, residential liberal arts education, and that, Zakiya just said, that's 10% of students. So we're basing 100% of our business, if most people here are in 4-year residential traditional liberal arts colleges, on 10% of a student population, and that is an enormous challenge. What I've seen in going from a private, residential private, back to a large public, and sitting in California in the last, say, 2 years or so, is an asymmetry that fascinates me between the publics and the privates. At least in California, and I realize this may be somewhat a unique situation, the publics are bursting at the seams. They cannot accommodate all the students who want to enroll, and this is as true of California State University East Bay as it is of Berkeley. Meanwhile, the privates, the local privates, are having trouble filling their beds and filling their classrooms, using very aggressive tuition discounting to do so. And where this brings me as something that I hope that we can spend more time talking about is what kinds of imaginative partnerships can we create? We have to think about college costs as not just the college, the kind of sticker price with the financial aid that we give to each student, 99 different price points that somebody was talking about before. Or what was it? No, 900 different price points. But rather, what's the cost to a family? And could we both increase access and serve students better if we started developing different kinds of partnerships with local community colleges, in which perhaps we would admit students to our colleges, but expect that they do the first year or the first 2 years at a local community college with a lot of connections to our college, way of reducing college cost. What kinds of partnerships could we imagine that might reduce the problems of very small scale, that might help us bend the cost curve? So I believe the most burning question for all of us is how to more adequately provide access to a more diverse student body, socioeconomically, ethnically, racially. But the economics of our institutions are working against that. So we have to think long and hard about not just how we can individually cut costs, but how we can imagine different kinds of organizational partnerships that might enable us to deliver education to students and their families more economically.
Thank you, Carol. Bobby.
So earlier I told Mary how I saw the link between these sessions, and I continue to see it. What I didn't anticipate, although I should have, was, boy, it's not good to follow a lunchtime speaker like that. The other panel, I asked if his book was as cleverly written as his spoken on higher ed finance, and it turns out I think it's going to be. But here I am. The couple things here. First of all, just where I'm coming from. There's sort of two primary lenses that I approach this, maybe a little different than most people here. One is, I'm really an organizer, not a community organizer in the traditional sense, but a campus organizer. I've spent literally since college, but also after college, trying to get campuses to do more of the second thing, which is the second lens, which is the civic, the community engagement work. So that's what I've been doing. And out of college, a year before the presidents got organized, we organized the students with a group called COOL, Campus Outreach Opportunity League. Has anybody here heard of that? Yeah, we didn't get a lot of money, so. But Campus Compact got all the money. But we were, back then, Apple computers were these small little things, and we would travel around with the little Apple computers, and Apple was an upstart, and we kind of felt a kinship to that. We never got the market share that Apple ended up gaining. But I've been an organizer and trying to get campuses to do more of this work. Then a number of years later, and the students who had the hardest time doing this work, doing a lot of it, were students on work study. And I was on work study, and there were other folks on campus who could do a lot more than I could do. And so the opportunity, when COOL went to a foundation, Wayne Meisel, who was the founding president of the Bonner Foundation, and he and I started COOL together, he came to this foundation, the Bonners wanted to do scholarships, so naturally we linked it to service. And the Bonner model is taking the work component of students, work study in particular, and turning that into off-campus community engagement. For all 4 years, 10 hours a week. And the original group of schools were all small privates who committed to not just helping them do that work study piece, but also capping their loans. So the Bonner Scholar Program at the original schools is a very expensive commitment on those schools to access. But our program is not really an access program per se, right? There's not a financial model that says, oh, we've got the silver bullet to how to address this issue. So in many ways, I think for this conversation, my contribution is more focusing on the opportunities students have on your campuses as the civic work has become more and more important, as it's flashed on the websites at a higher rate than ever before. That students, this generation, and I think I began to see this I got to Bonner in 92, maybe 95, 96. Some of the federal legislation around service learning in K through 12 had kicked in. And schools back then began to see students who'd done a lot more than they had done the year before. It was 95, 96 was the jump year. And all of you know this. All of you know campus, students are coming to campus eager and to do this kind of work. If you're a low-income student, you don't have the same time commitment. You don't have the same ability. So that's the one orientation I want to give. The second is that as we've been doing this work, and we have the Bonner programs, there's 40 to 100 students on a campus. The latest school, Brown, is going to have 160, it looks like, over the 4 years. So we've been working with all sides of schools. The original schools were all small privates. Now we're at University of Houston, which has, I think, 40,000 students. We're at UNC Chapel Hill and UNC Charlotte's the newest school starting up. So we work with a variety of schools. And I think the nature of the work isn't any different at all those schools. I think the nature of the challenges for the students in terms of being able to do this kind of civic work is not any different. The resources vary. So that's not an easy, there's no direct answer to that. But what's happened is it's been very successful. Our program's been successful, but it mirrors the best practices in the field. And the research on student outcomes around service learning and the rate, those kinds of things are off the charts. You know, the NESE, the George Koo stuff, the high impact practices, which all of you have read about. Well, the highest practice of those, the highest impact of those is service learning activity. And I would argue that most of that service learning is okay. There's not a lot of service involved. It was 20, 30 hours a semester maybe. A Bonner does that in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So but there's the highest one. It's never pulled out as sort of a significantly important practice, but I think the momentum is in our favor on this. So the question for us at the foundation isn't really how do we have more schools. There's about 60 schools in our network. It's not a dues-paying membership. It's sort of people are willing to run this program with their own funds and come to the meetings to participate in this community. The real conversation now, in many ways, is A, at the higher level. How do students tile these pieces together? So we're looking very hard at capstone. AACU refers to it as signature work. We're about to do a special edition of their Diversity and Democracy Digest on community engaged signature work. And I think the Bonner community of schools is it's a group of schools that are experimenting. And I think that's my biggest answer to this whole question of what to do next is we have to experiment like crazy. But for us, one of the big experiments is, in addition to figuring out that top level, how do you pull those pieces together for a student and, frankly, for a community partner? The second question is, how do you go to scale? A Bonner program is a great program, but it's maybe 40 students. We have schools with 16, 80, as I said, some are a little bit more than that. But even at the small colleges, that's a very small percentage. So what's the mechanism? What are the ways we take this as a campus-wide endeavor? And while doing so, deal with the cost issue. Because you can't grow proportionally the community engagement center or office staff to handle all those students. So it necessarily means faculty and looking at curriculum and all those other kind of things, which I'll save for a little bit later. But that's the kind of context I'm coming from, an organizer and somebody involved in the civic stuff and sort of working with a network of schools, sort of a learning community nationally.
So Carol and Bobby, you bring two very different perspectives to an access conversation that I think is important. Carol, you were talking about access equity. How do we achieve equity and who has access, whether it's our traditional 18 to 22-year-old, whether it's adult learners, parenting learners. So the question of access equity is one. Bobby, you talk about experiential equity. So once we bring students to our campuses, how do we ensure that they have some equity of experience? So if I'm a low-income student, your service learning sounds like a nice deal, but I've really got to work to be here, so I'm not going to be able to do that. Or study abroad seems like a good idea, but I don't have the resources in order to do that. So when we think about access, and we'll go to completion shortly, but when we think about access, what do you see as the biggest challenges from each of your perspectives? So Carol, from an access equity question, what is the biggest challenge? And Bobby, I'll ask you to think about that from an experiential
Well, there's several. I'm not sure I can name a single biggest, but certainly the economic barriers, both for the institution and for the individual, are huge. But even beyond that, I mean, most students go to college within 25 miles of where they live. And so, and especially for students coming from families that have less experience of college going, making sure they understand their options so they are not undermatching. That research has shown that students do better. Actually, their outcomes are less good when they when they're undermatching their school than if they go to a more challenging school. So providing that kind of information and counseling for students so that they find matches that perhaps are not within that 25-mile-an-hour radius, and then the institutions being really vigilant about equity of experience once students get to their campus.
So for you, the access question then is around who even has the awareness of who we are. So
That's exactly
who's
right.
going to opt in as opposed to select out when they see the sticker price,
Yes.
which was talked about earlier in the panel.
Yes.
So if we start with that, there are some steps we need to take to increase that awareness to breach that access equity piece. But then what do you do when a student lands on your campus, Bobby? What are some of the practices, or how do we sort of negotiate the experiential equity question?
There's a bunch of areas. So I was with the staff here. I had a couple hours before the opening session, and we sat down and we talked about the strategic plan at St. Ben's and all the different things that are going on with the engagement and experiential learning. And then we went through it, and then we ended up, as we always do on any campus, talked about transportation. Right? So it's almost mundane. I mean, it is mundane, but in fact, it becomes fundamental. I think that when I'm at highly selective schools, I live in the town of Princeton, so across the street, right? So those guys, they don't even know how many students are on work study, and they don't even know the jobs, right? And yet they're very concerned about it. A big Chronicle of Higher Ed article. It's not the opportunities to do the engagement stuff, like the community service work study, which they're required to spend 7% on. Every school is. There's no way. That's a word of mouth thing. There's no mechanism for those opportunities. Some of the things I'm seeing is that people are recognizing that internships, particularly summer internships, are incredibly valuable. And some schools are now making that a priority in fundraising. So they're purposely they're going to donors and saying, summer internships are critical here. This could be the January term as well. We know there's students who can't afford to do it. So we need to make this a priority within the capital, or not capital campaign, but in the fundraising campaign. We're seeing more and more of that recognition that if this kind of learning has a particularly strong impact. Let me just back up for 1 second. I was talking to a president just the other day, and he was saying, and I like his way of phrasing it. He said the liberal arts education, the disciplinary stuff, is the foundation. And what we want to do with this civic stuff is overlay on top of that. And I think the big growth there is going to be the overlay on top of that, which is not just do a bunch of it within sort of a random order, but in fact have students after a year and a half, 2 years, as they find their academic major, they find the issue they care about. And then we organize opportunities for them, curricular opportunities, undergraduate research, maybe community-based research, which is a research question defined by the community partner, and internship opportunities along that theme. And that the capstone stuff is where we move from, as we were talking earlier about, so the distinction between liberal arts and the tension between that and vocational preparation. That in this overlay, I think what we're doing too much in the service movement is talking about service, and not enough about change. We're talking about sort of what our involvement is, and not whether we're solving the problem. And solving the problems, and you hear people now talk about wicked problems, that's actually how we can organize at least a dimension of our curriculum and give students this opportunity. And Carol and I were talking at Smith. They've done this through academic concentration, so is McAllister. That's one structural mechanism to organize it. But that kind of thing becomes very exciting for students. These things they're drawing students like crazy. It allows us to sort of draw this theoretical and other kind of learning they have, regardless of their actual major, academic major, into some coherent thing that has job preparation for it. But as we design all that, as we go to scale, we have to think about mundane things like transportation, paid summer internships, and those kinds of components.
So often the conversation about access is one of financial access. It's how do I afford to get in? But I think one of the most disturbing things that I'm seeing, what we saw in higher ed last fall, what Zakia referenced when she talked about the Georgetown study, is that it's not that we are unable to get students in the door, it's that we're unable to provide them with experiences that either excite them or that they are able to afford, and then students walk out the door or they are unable to complete because we've not provided them with the experience we promised them, or they can't afford to pay for that experience. So my question to you is, how do we as a sector within higher education, how do we rethink our conversation about access and completion? And I want to go back to not being reductionist. So often we talk about access as how many students, how many low-income students, how many Pell Grant recipients, how many students of color we have. And we pride ourselves when those numbers escalate. How do we move that conversation to looking at the quality of the experience that students are having and the completion agenda as opposed to simply getting students in the door?
Yeah, so it's a central question, central to everything we do. And let me Let me share with you something that happened at Smith, because I think it provides an example of an answer to that question. Some of the science faculty at Smith became very concerned that although we were admitting the same number, the same proportion of majority and underrepresented minority students who wanted to major in the sciences, we were graduating far, far fewer students, underrepresented minority students in the sciences, and they found this unacceptable. So what they decided to do, they created a program, it's called the AIMS program, that in which they treated these underrepresented students who expressed an interest in majoring in the sciences in every way like our very star student recruits. We involved them in student research from the very beginning. We created a kind of peer mentorship ladder for these students in which the first years, we don't call them freshmen, first years were mentored by sophomores, then juniors by sophomores, then juniors by seniors. There was a social community that the faculty created of these students. These students not only graduated in the sciences, they excelled. They did honors theses, and these were students that did not look like the most competitively recruited students. This was a kind of page from the book of University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm sure many of you know about the extraordinary experience they've had there. I think you have to be deeply committed to every student's success when she walks in the door and provide all of the support services that enable that student to succeed. And so if a student fails once, it only is they failed the first time. They don't, it's not that this is something that is a kind of blemish and handicap for them.
But what you described was a change in how Smith operates. So
That's
I have
right.
this premise that all too often in higher education, we like the glow of having more diverse classes, but we're unwilling to be flexible ourselves in how we support those
right.
students. Can you talk a little bit about what that took to move your institution to change how it operated in order to grant access and support students through completion?
It really took passionate faculty. If I had had this idea as president, I'm sure it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But to have a passionate, respected faculty say, this matters to us, and this is how we're going to change our program, it meant the world. And now it's become a model for other parts of the campus.
Bobby, do you want to talk a little bit about, you talked about the general ed piece and then the overlay of civic engagement and the importance of high impact practices. One of the things we know about the high impact practices, and I need to see where Deborah is in the room, so if I misstate this, she can correct me quickly. One of the things we know is that the high impact practices are actually most beneficial to underrepresented, to low income students. When done well, we see their biggest benefit for our most vulnerable populations. Can you talk a little bit about what Bonner has found really drives the success, or when you think about service learning and civic engagement, what makes that particularly beneficial to underrepresented?
Well, one thing I would say is that what Carol just described at Smith, which I think was an academically oriented cohort.
That's right.
For us, it's a civic-minded cohort, right? It's a group of students who are being recruited and celebrated and supported because of their civic commitments. Now, they happen to be students in the original Scholar program, and I think largely in the Leader program. The Scholar and Leader only talks about how the funding is different between those two programs. But that their identity on campus is, as a Bonner, they're all known as the service superstars. And that happens, they come to school early before the regular orientation starts, and they have regular meetings weekly. They're doing all the community service stuff. They're in leadership roles within the program, and then within the Civic Engagement Center. 85% have another leadership role on campus. So they're the students who's, and actually Sonora is here, and I was saying, oh, look at those student leaders, photographs on the wall. She goes, well, actually, that third one's me. So they're those students, right? These are the students on campus who, A, wouldn't have had that opportunity because of time, and B, this extra support, and tapping into their commitments, what they're motivated towards, not their demographic. So it's a very different thing to say, here's our first generation college student program, and we're going to give you extra support so you can catch up to these guys, versus saying, you're going to be an academic leader. You're going to be somebody who's going to shine in this pursuit or you're going to be somebody who's going to make the world a better place. That's fundamentally, I think, at the heart of it. There's a whole bunch of practices as we've gone along. Bonner started in 1990 at Berea, when the high-impact practice literature came around. I mean, a lot of what we've done is sort of do it collectively with the schools and figure it out. Nobody wanted to talk about a 4-year model until they'd graduated the first group. So it's been very much a sort of learn by doing, experiment, enough schools around comparing notes with each other. Not just staff, but also students. I mean, Carol talked about the faculty are the key. I agree. But students are also key. And if you can get a group of students, and we're talking about a big enough group on a campus. I remember at the University of Richmond, it's maybe the second year of the program, the director calls. I was in the chaplaincy back then. And he calls and says, I'm getting calls from these faculty. I said, what are they asking you? He goes, they're asking me who these Bonners are. And I said, why are they asking that? They go, because they raise their hand and they say, I'm a Bonner, and then they ask a much better question, much more nuanced, much more, you take the theory and relate it to the real world than the typical students. So in that sense, Bonners have, and very other concrete examples, Bonners have been the ones recruiting the faculty, right? I'm dealing with this issue in the community. There's something I'm trying to solve. We need a course on this. I think the concentrations at Macalester, those are initiated by students with eager faculty to work with them. So I think the change model, I think, has to recognize that it's not just going to be top-down or middle-down, but there's also this bottom-up approach. And having a cohort that you support because of their, again, I have a hammer, so everything looks like a nail, so I apologize for that. I'm glad your example is academic. But I think that it's those best practices. By the time the high-impact practices came around, we recognized that there were a lot of stuff that we were already doing that fit that. Our biggest challenge is, by the way, at the top level. We haven't figured all that out, but we can get into that.
So, Bobby, what I'm hearing you say is that, and similarly at Smith, is that students come in and they bring talents to the institution, and it is our job to recognize, highlight, and celebrate those challenges and find a way to funnel them. That's how you address both access equity and experiential equity. But we don't see that happening across the board in higher education. We don't see it happening in the liberal arts. So we think about some of the data that Zakiya shared earlier. So my next question, this will be the final question that I'll ask, and then I'll turn it over to the group. My question is, what do we as a sector have a responsibility to do that we aren't currently doing? Is the problem that we aren't really viewing access and the students who come through access programs as an asset and strength to our institutions? So we're trying to put onto them what has worked in the past as opposed to allowing our institutions to be transformed by them? Is that the problem? Why aren't we across the board recognizing the strengths that students bring to us and enabling our institutions to be reshaped by them?
You know, there's a business strategist whose work I very much like, named Vijay Govindarajam. And he actually has just published a book. It's called The Three-Box Solution. And though he's been talking about this idea for many years, and he says all organizations of whatever kind, companies, institutions of higher education, have activities which fall roughly into 3 boxes. The first box is pursuing your core activities in the most effective and excellent way that you can. And he says we're all really good at that, and I think we recognize that, and I think that that's what we imagine. We're good at recruiting a diverse class, we pat ourselves on the back, and now we're going to offer the excellent education that we've always offered to those students who come in. The second is an idea that was very compelling to me, and meant a lot to me at Smith and means a lot to me now at Berkeley, is deliberate forgetting. We have to constantly ask ourselves, what are the assumptions? What are the practices that are no longer serving the institution as well as they might? And we have to engage in an act of deliberate forgetting. And I think some of that, the answer to your question lies in some deliberate forgetting of, yes, this is the way we've always taught things. So of course, these students are so fortunate to be here and they will thrive in this environment. And the third box, and he says most institutions don't do very much deliberate forgetting, and I think this is particularly true of colleges and universities, in part because of the snowflake phenomenon that I was talking about before, in part because we're inherently accretive institutions that never throw anything out. And the third box is the box of innovation. And his philosophy of innovation is very much throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And I think we have a lot of trouble innovating as institutions. So I think the answer to your question lies in a kind of very general terms in some deliberate forgetting and some innovation.
Bobby, do you want to add?
Yeah, I have a colleague who's doing her dissertation on higher ed, but she's looking at the diffusion of innovation, how that happens. And there's a theory there. You know, there's the innovators, and then there's the early adopters, and then there's that group, and then there's the laggards. And in my work, we see that across a spectrum of schools. Maybe it's not the whole school is at one point, but there's some aspect of what they're doing. So in my job, I'm looking for the front runners. I'm looking for the inventors of some new way of doing it. And I'm not just looking at the same type of school. I mean, one of the things that happens, again, I got Princeton across the street. I know that Princeton only talks to the other Ivies, plus Stanford, maybe Chicago. I've talked to them. I'm Tufts. You get thrown in that group. I know that happens, and people say, well, I can't do what they do because, look, they're a different kind of school. They got different kind of resources. It's not true. I mean, it is true in some cases about resources, but a good idea can be imported and adapted to your own context. The one that most intrigues me right now is we've been really involved in placing students in service. I was told here that you're not even allowed to use that phrase because there's labor laws about internships and placements. But if you think about the place, I'm going to go tutor kids. I'm going to go work at the soup kitchen. We're working on trying to expand that to doing projects, capacity building projects that have a beginning, middle, and end, where you do a research project, you do a policy analysis for an organization, you do some fundraising research, you build their website, you set up their marketing plan. There's lots of examples of that, but we don't do a lot of that. We don't do enough of that. That stuff especially can be tied to courses. So the model of a course on poverty, you go serve in the soup kitchen and write about that experience. That's sort of that mediocre service learning model. The high-level service learning models, you do a research paper, a community-based research paper, doing the homeless count for your city, and you turn that into something else, and then they're looking at there's a whole bunch of stuff around. I could pick a policy issue and sort of unwrap it in terms of the way we might get engaged in that. The second thing on that, just as a side note, is we work with direct service providers in our service. We don't work with the collaboratives, the alliances and coalitions, the groups that are the Alliance to End Homelessness in Mercer County. We don't work with them. Guess what? All their questions start with policy and research, then where the models are, and where's the money, and then how do we implement the program, how to evaluate it, assess it, and then recruit volunteers. There's a whole spectrum there of work that is out there for us. And I think that's the kind of partnership we need to be creating. And as I look at the diffusion of innovation in our work, we're trying to find that. The other thing I'll just mention briefly is I was at a conference, WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. They've done project-based learning for 40 years. So I was listening to their presentation. And they do it beautifully, by the way, if you ever get to hear it. They start with the senior project, and they work back. They sort of explain, this is the thing that happens, and then this is how we get there. They have a junior project that leads the senior project, not the same project, but developmentally the students are learning how to do things there that they're, and then all the way down to freshman year. Their projects are 9 credits, but they're not a course. They're also team-based, and there's a faculty advisor. So all right there, to me, I'm saying, oh, wait a second, you've got, because time's the big ingredient here, right? My time, students' time, anybody's time. So all of a sudden you've got 9 credit hours, whatever that time commitment looks like, of students to work on a project, mostly community-based projects in their case. And you have a faculty advisor to that who's not teaching 9 credits of courses in the traditional model. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is one of our schools just redesigned their major in sort of public policies, community engagement kind of stuff. It's now called Civic Innovations. And they've got those 3 and 4 credit courses, but they also have 1 credit courses on fundraising, 1 credit, there's a series of those. And it's just interesting to think about time from an academic standpoint, because to go to scale, we're going to have the faculty buy in. I think we're going to get that generationally. I think it's happening anyway to some degree. I think we're seeing that. I'm seeing that as I go to campuses. We're going to get it because our students are demanding it. I think it answers the question of the imperative around for preparation for work. but also life purpose. I think the Bonner scholars, the alumni we've reached out to and surveyed are off the charts, and all those, they voted at the highest rate, 100%. They're all volunteering. Their sense of life purpose and satisfaction is extremely, on all those dimensions. We didn't use the Gallup questions, but we're going to redesign it and go back and pull some of those questions in so we can do some comparison. So I think we're going to be very good on that dimension. The issue for us is about scale. How do we do it for everybody? And the innovation there is going to have to come in these borrowing from other people, as well as being willing to try something and fail, and then try it again.
So what you're hearing from our panelists, I think, is that access is really about not only getting young people in the door, but providing them with an experience. And to provide the deepest, richest experience, it involves listening to both the young people and the faculty about what that needs to look like, being willing to transform our own institutions, and in thinking about what are the key ways we can engage young people so that there's experiential equity towards a completion end. So with that summary, why don't we open it up to the group for questions? Hi.
This is just on that last topic that sometimes the access to high-impact experiences is asymmetrical. I am involved heavily with study abroad programs at my college, and we see the students taking part in those as really a very different population than the cross-section of our students who are already not a cross-section of the wider population. Obviously, students who study abroad can't work for that semester, and in our case, it typically costs more. We charge over and above what tuition would normally be to take part in some of these programs. So we're losing, we're basically closing off access to those high-impact practices right from the start. What suggestions do you have for us? How can we broaden access to that particular high-impact practice?
That's a really good question, and it's one of the central questions when you ask yourself as an institution about equity of experience. The situation you're describing, there's no equity of experience in regard to study abroad. So things that I might suggest you think about are financial aid, raising money for financial aid that would reduce the work or work-study commitment of students going abroad, looking for lower cost places. Some institutions I know make money on study abroad because it's cheaper for the students to study in certain parts of the globe than it is in the United States. And then thinking about other ways of providing international experience for students that give students that same access. I think it's really important to think about programs. This expands on what Bobby said, not always as additive, but as substitutes for things that we do, so that I thought that the example that you gave from WPI was wonderful, because this is a more economical delivery of higher education, in addition to sounding like a terrific program.
And actually, just on that one point, the WPI example, their projects are international but also local. And they do their very extensive surveys, and the outcomes from the student satisfaction standpoint of the folks who did a community-based project locally were just as high as the ones that went abroad.
So that actually might be one of the good questions. I think we certainly prize study abroad. It's one of the signature parts of a St. Ben, St. John's experience. But to what end? I think that's one of the questions that we don't always wrestle with when we think about access. To what end are we doing this? What is it that we hope students get out of it? Is that the most effective thing for all students? And how do we have an open conversation about that on our campuses? Other questions? Right here. Yeah. We can go here, and then we'll go right over there.
Thank you. I'm curious, and I speak from the, thank you. Okay. I'm curious, and I speak from the perspective of a faculty member at a liberal arts college, and I'm particularly interested in change at my institution, and perhaps other colleagues are interested in change, about how we move from a mindset of looking at students we want to have access to our institution. How do we move from a mindset of academic deficits and the challenges that that poses for each institution, to one of the talents and skills and assets that those students bring. That's a really, to me, a very important mindset shift that needs to happen at institutions, and I think it ties in with Carol's points about how we make creative changes at institutions, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. One of the things that I had thought about mentioning was the gross inequities in our secondary school system, and the fact that so many of our students with no differences in actual raw intelligence come with dramatically different levels of preparation. And I think it's our responsibility as institutions to provide just in time, I'm going to use the word remediation, but to give them exposure or access to the content that they may not have gotten, whether it's in math or whether it's in writing. And I think that here community college partnerships might be very helpful. Identifying students early and trying to figure out what work they might need to do that would enable them to be as successful as every student, doing just-in-time tutorials. I think that there is enormous potential for a combination of online and tutoring help in quantitative areas as a way of getting students to be up to the level of preparation of other students. But I think that, you know, our thinking not these students have deficits, but we want to give these students every tool they need to be successful, and what's the most effective way of getting these tools to them quickly so that they can take advantage of every opportunity we have to offer.
Do you want to add to that?
I just add one small thing, and it's sort of maybe a little part of your question, or at least it makes me think about, you know, one of the things that students who succeed, they find a home. They find a reason why they're there, something they care about. And the students we work with, one of the questions I always ask, I've been asked it for 25 years, which is sort of what difference does it mean to be here? I mean, to be a Bonner here. And it depends on the school, but if it's a wealthier school, one of the very early folks said, oh, this is the only group of students I can talk to about not having any money. People have cars, all that kind of stuff. And I've heard that repeated over time. The larger thing they talk about is their sense of purpose, right? A group of students who care as much about changing the world as I do. And I think those things are not small. I think those are big. The last thing I'll tell you is that I was at a school recently, and I met with 6 of these Bonners. They were juniors and seniors, and I asked that question, and we got into a discussion. 4 of them would have left at the end of the freshman year or during the freshman year had they not been Bonners. And part of that's because there are other students who care about what they care about. Part of it's because there's a staff member or 2 that know their business and are talking to them. But the other part of it, which didn't surprise me, but what's important to convey, is they had built a relationship off campus with a kid or a grown-up in some community setting, for many of them not unlike maybe where they grew up. And so their sense of when they talk about school, one of the questions I ask is, when you go home and talk about to your high school buddies what's like being at your school, what do you talk about? They talk about the neighborhood. They talk about where they're doing their service. So their sense of belonging is in that bubble that everybody talks about. They're back and forth through that all the time. It's much different, and I think provides a kind of a resource to them in their struggles through the other stuff they have to do. That's, I think, very important to their success.
I think implied in the notion of allowing students to transform our institutions is the idea that so often one of the things we do, one of the things that we've not addressed in selective forgetting in box 2, is we bring students in and we're going to make them just like us. I'm going to bring you to my campus. I'm going to make you just like I am, just like Benny's have been for 103 years. You're going to be just like us. I think part of the access equation is really flipping that on its head and saying, there are some things we need to forget about who we are and what we are. And we're going to bring you in because you bring something to make us different, and we value and we embrace that. And so I think that's part of the organizational challenge, and those are fragile steps to take in our institutions, because one of the things we do well is we conserve who we are and we conserve our traditions, But part of access, absolutely, you're absolutely right. It is saying that we're going to not see adding you to our community as a deficit or having to help you make up for something. We're going to see adding you to our community as beneficial to us and transformative for us.
Well, thanks very much. And Carol, I want to start by saying I'm going to start where you did, which is to talk about the strategy of partnerships with community colleges. And we're in Southern California. We're at the University of Redlands. And I bring it up because our context will be similar to others. We know that one of the challenges we face is that the local community college students already have identified us as not a place that they can go for many of the reasons you're talking about. Too elite, not the place where they belong, and they're very actively recruited by their advisors and their counselors to go to Cal States or UCs instead.
Yeah.
So what I want to ask about is the following. What are some ways that the engagement practices, be they what perhaps the Bonner Foundation's engaged with or study abroad or other things, are there ways that you or others are familiar with that helps convince those students that they can find a home through those kinds of engagement or immersive practices that will help us talk about more than just what might be an academic or a sort of professional career pathway? So that's question one. The second one's very different. I'd like to know if the institutions you work with in Bonner Foundation have got retention or persistence data, that shows that it's helped keep some students engaged on campuses, because sometimes we know that we lose students again because they haven't found a home. Those are really my two questions for you or others. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, California faces a particular challenge. The state institutions are so much the default answer to any student aspiring to a four-year college education that unless you're Stanford or Caltech or USC, I think you really struggle to have an identity in this landscape, and often you're seen as, oh, that school isn't for me. I've been curious about whether, I'm going to describe an experience that Berkeley has had that I was describing earlier to some people that's been very successful, and suggest, I think, a kind of public-private version of that might be useful. Berkeley, like many institutions, admits some students for the spring, often students who are less sterling than the ones who are, but still very, very good. And it's offered for some years now. It's called the Fall Extension Program, not a very glamorous name. It's for what I think of as a pod, or a group of 700 students who take all their classes at a Baptist seminary that cannot any longer recruit enough prospective Baptist ministers to fill its campus. And they take a very limited set of classes, very intensive advising, and then they move to Berkeley in the spring. These students graduate at higher rates and have higher GPAs than the fall admits. And I've often wondered whether private colleges might do that kind of thing, might have pods of students on community college campuses, or might advertise a dual admit. Come to, University of Redlands, I don't know what your feeder community colleges might be, but you'd be dual admitted to whatever it is, and University of Redlands, and we'll give you a 4-year degree for X amount of money. But I think our partnerships need to be a lot more both aggressive and more, much more working together than they currently are.
Yeah, I'll build on two things. On the Berkeley example, Emory University's original campus was 45 minutes away from Atlanta. And they've kept that campus, and they've turned it into a 2-year institution, a feeder. It's part of Emory, but you go there, and there's often students who they think might struggle, and they also graduate at a higher rate from the 4-year school. They get the smaller experience before they go to the larger. There are a couple of our schools in New Jersey who there's a Bonner program at a couple community colleges, and they end up going to one of the Bonner, or schools that have a Bonner program at Rutgers or TCNJ or even Rider University. We've been having some conversations with Augsburg, which is looking for some funding to do that experiment in just down the road. And again, the conversation there is have a Bonner program at that 2-year institution, which our observation is there's never staff to run it. So maybe what happens is there's a staff member there who runs the reflection discussion once a month. The other once a month would be on Augsburg's campus, so they're with the other Bonners, and they're doing their service side by side at the same agencies. So this Bonner identity is one that we see it nationally when we bring students together, is very strong. And again, it's not about just once the name, but this commitment students are making. And I think there's something there that may work, and it's something that we're going to try at a few schools in New Jersey. We haven't done anything formal in terms of raising some money and really doing something of real seriousness and study it to see. But I think there's real potential there. In terms of retention, it's only school by school. We don't track currently if the student leaves Bonner but stays in school, so we don't really know precisely. But it's higher almost everywhere. At the schools that Davidson College graduates 95%, 96%, we're 93 or 4. But at a school that graduates 35%, Bonner's graduated 65, 70, 80%. So there's a very clear thing going on that way. We're also going to do, so we're about to launch sort of a data collection thing on those sort of easier to grab data points that schools have and pull that together in some fashion to be able to tell the story. Because it's one of the first questions administrators ask when they want to consider Bonner program.
So I think we are out of time. I hope that this has been helpful in thinking about some of the questions of access. We will have a break until, I believe, 3 o'clock, if I'm remembering the program correctly. Please join me in thanking Carol, Chris, and Bobby Hackett for their time.